Hey there, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and today we have the newest album from Seeming the World. So midway through the hellscape of 2020, pretty much by accident, I discovered on Bandcamp the Birdwatcher's Guide to the Apocalypse by Seeming, a pretty awesome industrial/EBM album from mastermind Alex Reed, formerly of Thou Shalt Not, that blended its pulsating grooves with touches of chamber pop, huge hooks, and the sort of studied radical left-wing politics that would leave the average liberal commercial punk in the dust. That was more prepared for the action required in protest than so many have the stomach to accept, including myself at that time. And it's been a long 5 years since that project, where I've been eagerly anticipating a follow-up. But before we get there, let's briefly talk about the one that actually dropped a month later in 2020, Monster. And I know exactly why I didn't cover it. I was in the process of moving amidst the avalanche of 2020. I know y'all are trying not to remember, but the sooner y'all process and get through the year, the better, but also because it really did feel like a B-side album that just didn't have the same grandeur or magnetism. A retreat back into more slightly conventional industrial darkwave with some really questionable warbling vocal filters that just threw me off so aggressively that I struggled to appreciate the lyrics that were just as sharp as ever. But either way, this has been one of the last notable releases I've really been anticipating in 2025. I was excited for this, and yet even then, I was not expecting it. Folks, I don't say this lightly. Albums like The World by Seeming are why I don't just release the year-end list in early December and view it as damn near malpractice by the writers/critics who do, even if there's a part of me that knows in my gut, even if this album had been released a couple months earlier, they probably would not have acknowledged it in the way they really should have. Part of this goes back to the Birdwatcher's Guide, where in its radicalism, it just wouldn't be that accepted by the mainstream public. But I'm also reminded of when I put Go Small on my favorite songs of 2020, and there was a considerable number of folks in my comments who just couldn't look past a lower budget, edgy theatrical aesthetic and the complete sincerity and purpose in the sound and music video to engage with what actually put forward. But even then, that album also had some pacing issues and production that couldn't always pay off Reed's ambitions. It was great, but not quite among the very best of the year. So to hear The World, it feels like the necessary amplification of the best elements, ramping into more dynamic and expansive industrial darkwave, giving the Baroque chamber pop elements more room to pop and breathe and accentuate the hooks with a lot of sweeping, organic melodies, while also expanding the humanist scope of all the songwriting. Look, folks, it feels like the album I've been waiting for all goddamn year. It was genuinely thrilling taking it all in. But I also do feel like I have to add a caveat to begin this review, especially to fans of more challenging or visceral industrial music, and who might find this, well, a little too clean or melodic in its aesthetic, if not subject matter. A huge part of this is Alex Reed himself, who has a huge commanding baritone that is built for theatrical pop rock as anything else, and while there are songs where he pushes a little bit more visceral grit in his voice, if you're looking for a more cohesively nasty industrial timbre in the vein of like Skinny Puppy or Throbbing Gristle, this is not going to be that. My argument would be that given the populism Reed is working to cultivate, that cleaner register and delivery works wonders, as does the occasional sweeping strings or piano melody, or how amidst the churning whirs of the groove of Heart of Hunger, it's got some gorgeous aching cello and busts out a goddamn trumpet of all things, where it can just shine amidst the pummeling percussive grooves. But that's not gonna be for everyone, even in industrial. When accessible becomes the dirty word, Seeming would get some real derisive sneers from the purist. I can hear that Sleep Token comparison being made from here. But you know, with Sleep Token, where even in Arcadia felt intensely compromised by every attempt to embrace a more mainstream sound, I blame their label, where it seemed perpetually at odds with itself, Seeming does not. Rather feeling more like the embrace of one's natural skill set and the amplification of the unique timbres within. The songwriting topics and poetry and grooves, they feel feel larger, but they're not shying away from the challenging implications behind them. If you're drawn in by the melody and Reed's very striking delivery, it might feel honestly kind of dissonant when you're forced then to engage with what he actually has to say or everything around him. A shock to the nervous system in the plain spoken of reality of what must be done. But before we even get into all of that, I really want to highlight how strong so many of these songs are, how potent and balanced and complex the production is, where from the opening track, A Failure of Imagination, you get the impression that might not actually be the case. The slow aching build of the strings as the pounding drums begin ramping up, so when the grinding and glitchy synths begin saturating the mix against all the rest of the elegance, it's actually a little oppressively loud, but it still feels balanced, especially as the strings break into these weedy saws as the noise crashes into the grimy stomp of Heart of Hunger. And you hear something very similar in the flute shudders throughout a lot of the emptiness to build over the oily warp of the album highlights Spiral, as the song spills over keys and multiple tempo-breaking crescendos and changes as the pulse-pounding percussion just crashes through. And the more intricate drum patterns that balance texture with booming impact, that's integral to the album. The fizzy stutter that booms around the ponderous flutter of the synth and the churning post-punk bass of Tomorrow Place, that then picks up so much reverb, simmer, and tempo on Any Other World, as the keys will just leap into this processed mid-chorus melodic flourish that is utterly magnetic. It could have anchored the entire song on its own. Then you have the striking echo of the minor piano chords as the cymbals and the snare just shamble together alongside the gentle rollick of the guitar to assemble that drum fill and the actual gallop on Shackleton. Then you have the frigid metallic pulse coursing throughout Nova as the drums feel so implacable. Now, there are two songs where I think that the groove doesn't quite coalesce for me fully. The first being the very obvious vintage industrial, the clipped sample, and a lot of the shambling patter that comes on Grindshow, one of the singles. Although some of that might come with Reed's two-tone pseudo-rap delivery, which can feel a little bit awkwardly emphasized, at least for me. But the more frustrating example might be Zebra Tramples Horse Trainer, with the weedy lead synth leaning on more pulsing electronica, where the more claustrophobic mix feels very intentional in that regard, and the processed falsetto flourishes that are intended to destabilize that rigorous textured warp and the shattering glass. There's a rigid momentum and you're trying to break out, where I can imagine it getting smuggled into a darker dance mix and it would work, but with more confined atmosphere and the declarative shouts and some of the word choices in the poetry, it cracks the verisimilitude more than you would hope. And make no mistake, for as crushingly sincere as the messaging can be in the lyrics, you want that atmosphere to be as charged and explosive as possible to avoid the easy, way too cool critical eye roll at how heavy-handed it all is. Not that the super cool can't be so easily co-opted from the revolution by capital, so maybe there is something to be so grandiose and cinematic as possible, just cut them out of the picture, but you want to be able to take it seriously. And credit to Seeming and the writing, they fucking get there. If Birdwatcher's Guide and Monster were built on those already on the ground as adages of self-care and survival, The World feels like the manifesto that's staring straight into apocalypse with the stark realization that you've got to think big on the level of societal transformation. The opener, Failure of Imagination, looks at the billionaire thoughts of escape to other planets, and then challenges to rip the Overton window much wider to the left, bringing the ideas they don't want to tell you about. And so much of that, well, yeah, it could feel a bit basic to say that human connection and emotion and passion, those relationships underscores all of it, but it's the same continuity of heady radicalism that underscored queer and marginalized communities for decades, where Grindshow feels deliberately rooted in the revelation that once you see and experience that space, hear those ideas, you're not going to be able to stop hearing them. And you can be drawn into that expanse if you got abandoned, you have nothing left. Where much of this album's first half circles the reality of being human and uncontainable, or just embracing the animal spirit within. Zebra Tramples Horse Trainer. Now, Special Interest touched on a lot of this in Endure in 2022, and Alex Reid knows as much as anyone this is not new philosophy. But what he does understand is that once the high and quite dangerous stakes are known and then spoken aloud, especially with the constant reality of climate change that will then intertwine with a lot of authoritarian consolidation, you got to be able to motivate someone beyond the fear, the enervating despair, or climate grief, and what so much is going to be lost. So there is a certain amount of transformational myth-making required to energize people. Again, this isn't new either. Clipping did a lot of this on Dead Channel Sky just this year, drawing on the legacy of cyberpunk and hip-hop, which is really only a half step away from industrial. But Seeming manages to capture a certain dramatic, dare I say, romance to the struggle that speaks beyond just the clinical, data-driven reality that can be easily obfuscated in an online too-much data world. Not just escape, but radical response. It's why Any Other World is a desperate, tragic love song that yearns for utopia but has to exist in this world. And Nova feels so damn explosive to capture the spark of what that newfound possibility to fight really means. Even if in Spiral, loaded with imagery of the light-bending madness of black holes, Nova to the black hole, cute, it might rip apart everything one is and what can't even be known in that information of light. Now that will take us to arguably the most contentious and gorgeously simple song on this album, as the strings and synth linger over the textured expanse. Assassin's Love Song, speaking from the perspective of someone who does that deed with the realization it could fundamentally change the world. The album's been building up to this moment, where all manner of country songs from other acts have been written about the criminal facing down the law, coming for that final bloody confrontation in the end. And Stephen Sondheim made an entire musical called Assassins, exploring this subject in messy detail, with less focus on explicit politics and more on said assassins' human motivations. Always condemning the act, but never denying the world-changing impact. But make no mistake, this song is gorgeous, and within the text of the album feels dramatically earned and apropos. If you've all been pushed to the brink, and you know the removal, the right target could change the world, inspire the right moment, movement, revolution. And the song is also smart enough to show martyrdom, but never center one's chase of legacy or glory, the hook embracing a softer tenderness that makes sense even as the transmission necessarily degrades in the context of an explicit anti-fascist work. But again, so was Cabaret, and the blurry line of removal of context and co-option, especially when the violence is explicit, that's dangerous, especially when the media to shape that narrative is not on your side. And this was a question that I had and lingered over Birdwatcher's Guide to the Apocalypse and the explicit targets named on that album, and that specific target who faced multiple assassination attempts in 2024. It's not complicated to acknowledge the role that violence plays in politics every day, and the cruel calculus of who is considered a legitimate target can, and for the modern government down south, already has opened some very dark doors. But it's a lot more daring to not only expressly admit it, but then throw aside any murky complexifiers and frame it as unabashedly a choice made for the better. Certainly a more challenging lane than the majority of edgy music across the political spectrum, especially on the right these days. And I'm not even saying it's wrong, especially given the stakes that are at play. Even if I'm referring to my adages for political art, it's a risky play to eschew greater precision in favor of power and way more populism. I am saying that putting it on record is making a choice. Might not always be the best praxis or OPSEC. It got Eminem interrogated twice by the Secret Service of 2 different Republican presidents. And honestly, from there, it's kind of difficult to walk back away from the brink. But I think Alex Reid may have stuck the landing with Winterlight, telling the story of falling through the ice as a kid, the desperate survival instinct he needed in order to save himself from freezing to death, and how that instinct now infuses his art, where there's no jokes being made about suicide, it can feel too real. Where the reference to Christmas Eve feels intentional in both the winter release paratext and the album subtext, drawing forth a time a holiday where people can naturally come together, religion or not, and where the performance and the attempt to spread the message can affirm one's life. That's enough, especially as Alex Reid is keen to know that at a certain point, it stops being phantomime or myth-making. It simply is. Past the brink of separating art from artist, because that core, that's, let's call it truth. It's what makes life worth living. And you know, it's fascinating reviewing this album right after Geese is getting killed, because as much as Cameron Winter was chasing this raw, unbridled truth, an uncompromised and ugly view internally to chase it, Alex Reid and Seeming get way closer to it across the board. The sort of amplification of experimentation in both sound, content, and politics that necessarily has populism and firepower in order to stir the spirit, but is so utterly unconcerned with catering to modern good taste, especially online, or coolness, that it actually winds up feeling way more radical. It's not new politics, the anti-fascist and I'd say eco-anarchist philosophy. Please correct me if I'm off on that. It's got deep notes in philosophy and art, and Reid's knowledge of industrial music history certainly plays into textures and references across this album. It certainly illustrates that continuity, but it's also paired with the reality that a new change is desperately needed, painting a broad enough vision to actually maybe get there. Do I think it's an easy recommendation? Fuck no! Forget the politics for a second, or even if you agree with those politics, the unironic presentation and the bombast sets up way too many who will be eager to dismiss this as corny, campy, theatrical anthems over substance. Lord only knows what would happen to those who make a big deal about having good taste online if they hear this. It seems built to offend them, or at the very least not be taken seriously by those who aren't in community, or think that none of this is realistic, or it's just edgy provocation. But taste and coolness are more social constructs co-opted to reinforce the status quo than actually challenge anything outside of very specific narrow examples. And as someone who's never claimed to have much good taste or coolness, yeah, this was everything I needed in 2025. Truly spellbinding, and if it sounds like it's up your alley at all, folks, the year ain't over yet. Do yourself a favor, please check this out. You're not gonna regret it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you want to see more, please be sure to like, share, drop comments, subscribe. I know this album is going to be a tough sell to a lot of people. I know for a fact that if this is going to make my year-end list, and it might just be me and a very sparse list of other people who have this on this list. It's not going to be considered a cool album. I don't make that comparison to someone like Sleep Token lightly, especially in the genre blurring. I can also see people making like comparisons to like Imagine Dragons or some other radio rock acts that go over the top and don't have subtlety. I think there's a lot more subtlety going on in the fine details. The writing's too dense otherwise, but if you're going to be recommending this, you are going to be working uphill. I hate to say that, even as much as I really do think people should hear this. But hey, beyond that, leave your comments down there below. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if y'all want to get involved in supporting the channel, getting albums on my schedule when the new year starts back up, or hell, just arguing with me on my Discord, or maybe seeing some videos like year-end list early, we'll have to see about that. Link to my Patreon and YouTube memberships is right over there. Don't feel obligated. Tough times out there. Recession seems inevitable. Take care of yourselves. But I'll be just fine, but options available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.